of ease. So this is Rosa Arcus, the rainbow rose. There are so many different varieties of roses, and they're classified according to their shapes and their colors, their growing habits, that to undertake the task of even classifying them is really quite the ordeal. There are about 6,500 species of roses, and more are being introduced every single year. So that really are arguably the queen of flowers. So while we actually don't have Rosa Arcus right now, I wouldn't be surprised if someone is trying it, trying to breed something like this, which I think would be really interesting. So tonight we're going to take a look at some different classifications of roses, going to take a look at how we buy them, tips for planting them, and then maintaining them. We'll also talk a little bit about winter protection, what kind of roses you might pick for your area, and kind of look forward what is next in the rose world.
Amanda, so I'm getting some feedback every once in a while. I don't know if it's your speaker or it's not all the time. It's just once in a while I get a little bit of it.
Bluetooth. Like you can double hear me?
No, it's like a scratch sound almost. Does that make sense? Like static sound.
I wonder if it's my hair against. I wonder if it's my hair against my earphone. Try that. Let me know.
All right, I'll let you know.
Maybe it's brushing up against the earphone, which is the microphone too. But roses have a really rich history, very deep history. The ancient Greek poetess Sappho, she lived about 6 centuries before Christ, called the rose the queen of flowers. It's been reported the emperor of Rome in the early, like about 50 AD, he was fond of having these big rose feasts. It's been recorded that he spent about $150,000, like what would be the equivalent of $150,000 just on roses for one single banquet. So he's quite fond of them. In the early 19th century, Empress Josephine, the wife of Napoleon of France, requested that a plant from every specimen in Europe be represented in her garden. So from there, the French rose growers were really greatly inspired and began to grow a lot of new varieties. So you see a lot of them coming out of with European ties. We're going to look at some of the more common ones and a couple uncommon ones at types of roses, and provide some examples of how each, examples of each and how their care might differ from one another. And then kind of talk about, we'll talk first kind of about the rose industry's dilemma, right? Because some people are intimidated a little bit by growing roses. We have just this rich history. Like I've said, they've been used for medicinal purposes, for perfume, even in some cases that they were a legal tender to be traded. They have been, America's floral emblem for a number of decades, and they've had a lot of symbolism over the past, or forever, as long as they've existed. So they really kind of come across as maybe a really difficult plant to take care of, or that come with a lot of this history, and so they seem overwhelming. And so the rose industry really has kind of taken a look at, well, what does the modern gardener need? The modern gardener has less space, might have less time than we've ever had, and they want a lot of color for a small space, and they want plants that are easy to take care of. We also have situations where we're kind of mixing things a little bit more, mixing baskets, and they're putting things on containers or patio gardening. And we also have a lot of heavy climatic disease pressure. So not so much your traditional rose garden is not what most people have anymore, where we have those really long stemmed, beautiful shaped flowers. Those are more formal, used for cutting for really avid gardeners. Maybe you had a grandma or a rosarian. I don't know if Morrow County or wherever you're from has a rosarian society. We do over here in the western part of Ohio. But some people can get really into them. But you're probably not one of them. So we're going to kind of just break down what kind of different types that you can have for your area, and hopefully be just a little bit more confident. Maybe you won't come away as a rosarian, but you'll come away just a little bit more confident than before. So the types of roses, what really made a big splash was this knockout rose that really changed the industry. It's supposed to be, resistant to certain diseases. It's going to be this ever blooming perennial that you have. It's kind of marketed this way, marketed to the landscape industry. We saw a lot of knockout roses being installed by landscaping companies in the past couple or since it came out, and it was really well known and heavily promoted by the media. Most people, who are even vaguely interested in roses have heard of the knockouts. They were introduced in early 2000, and they were kind of that lazy gardener's dream, right? No disease, no watering, no fertilizing, blooms from spring till frost. It's super cold hardy. While some of these are, sort of true, they're not exactly true. They are pretty good options, but they are not completely disease resistant. They are not no care. They are not completely resistant to the winter weather we have here. They can get knocked down pretty easily, or especially by hard weather. It's happened just a couple of years ago. But they are a good choice for some situations. So let's take a look at a couple other types. The climbing rose, it's generally a term for roses that produce these really long, vigorous canes that can't support their own weight. Unlike other plants that climb, that typically have like tendrils, think of something like a pumpkin or a cucumber. They have tendrils that could support their own weight if they were climbing. These don't have those. These can also be used as ground cover if there isn't a supporting structure. They're not as vigorous as some of the other rambling roses that we'll cover here in a bit, but they do pretty well. Climbing roses can grow anywhere from 6 to 12 feet long. They spread about 3 to 4 feet wide, but they can be well adapted for small gardens. They can produce a really large abundance of flowers. They could be single or clustered, and they're often pretty fragrant. They repeat flower throughout the summer and the fall, 2 or more times a season, first on the old canes and then on new growth. Some of these cultivars can bloom continuously throughout the season. And because of some interbreeding, there are a number of ever blooming climbers that produce from early summer until the first frost. So these can be pretty good options. These are types of roses that need annual pruning and training, like you see here. This one's obviously, you can't hardly even see it, but it's probably being on some sort of trellis and of course then supported by the wall. But really can be kind of a striking piece. You can see that can be used as a small garden. If you had a small garden and some structure to go up, it might choose a climbing one to kind of add some height and some depth to your garden. Some other notable ones: climbing roses, the candy cane you see here on the left, and Rainbow's End is more of a kind of almost a miniature type on the right. The other examples are Polka, which is an apricot blend. That was on the left. And the 4th of July, which is a red bloom and kind of almost, reminds you of those firecrackers you might see on the 4th of July. So just a couple examples. You can see kind of the variety there that you might encounter with climbing roses. So then we come to the ever blooming climbers. These ever blooming climbers, they're much less vigorous than like a rambler or a slow growing rose. So these are also good for small gardens. They are heavy spring flowers, or they have heavy flush of spring flowers. And then they might bloom again in the fall if the conditions are right. So this is not kind of a guarantee. They are kind of, if the conditions are right, they could bloom in the fall. They really do quite well, though, as far as winter hardiness, and they're a little bit more disease resistant than some of the other kind of this more spreading type, like the climbers and the ramblers and things. These bloom, actually, interestingly, these bloom more freely if they're trained horizontally rather than vertically. So kind of just something interesting to keep in mind. But a little bit slower growing, a little bit less vigorous than the ramblers, which we'll look at next. These ramblers are kind of like an old-fashioned climber. They can grow up to 20 feet in one season, and they typically produce these small flowers in these really large, dense clusters. Sometimes they can even have about 20 blooms per stem, but they only bloom in spring or early summer for several weeks, but they only bloom once. These plants are usually hardy, more so than climbers. Just a little bit more of an old fashioned, a little bit more hardy, but they are susceptible to a mildew, which is a foliar disease. So that is a caution with ramblers. Some examples of ramblers: open arms, Phyllis Bide, kind of a little bit more what I probably would consider, this is not really, scientific term, but kind of like more like antique looking rose, can be pretty fragrant as well. Climbers and ramblers can pair well with clematis. So that might be something to think about. They can share the same arch or trellis, or if you have a pergola or maybe a doorway, they have kind of the same natural needs and the same growing conditions. They need rich, moist, well-drained soil. They benefit often from the same type of fertilizer you would use. What's good for clematis would be good for roses as well. And they're kind of similar in size. So one of them doesn't really swallow the other one. So they really kind of pair well with one another. Clematis foliage can hide those rose kind of bare legs, and the roses kind of add to their fragrance as well. So consider, if you're considering, kind of having these together, make sure you select roses and clematis with maybe different flowering periods so that you have extended color. And I would stick to those kind of small flowered clematis over the really large flowered ones that don't typically have a fragrance, and sometimes those can be prone to a wilt as well. I didn't say this, but if you do have questions, feel free to type it in the chat. I think maybe you shared that, Carrie, and you can interrupt me as it need be.
We don't have any yet.
Okay. Another type of rose that has been around since the mid 1800s is the hybrid tea. In most cases, these are flowers that are kind of born singularly. Just these are those typical like long stem roses. The buds are usually, pointed and long. The stems are often long themselves, and that makes them really great for flower arrangements. These don't produce as many types of, or as many flowers as the other types that we've looked at, and they don't form a strong bush, but rather kind of a lot of canes that come out of a plant base. I think of like a raspberry bush or a blackberry bush or something like that, very similar. They vary greatly in their winter hardiness, and they often need winter protection. Sometimes they'll have, or most of them really actually have a fragrance, and they are usually hardy for our zone, but it is something, we always recommend when you're looking at a new plant for your landscape, make sure that it's rated for for your zone. These are typically larger flowers though, so definitely a different, if you have a arrangement is your goals, then you'd want to select something more like this than the ones that we've obviously looked at here before previously. The climbers don't want those, don't sit well in a vase. Another type of roses is the polyantha. The polyantha rose bush, it kind of took place, or kind of was bred about 15 years after the hybrid teas in France again. A polyantha rose bush, it has these beautiful clusters of a pretty kind of, it can be any color, but lots of different clusters here. They were born from actually crossing a wild rose. And they're a pretty small plant. They produce a lot of clusters with petals that rest upon these like really sturdy stems. They can be grown in small containers or next to walkways or maybe in front of garden beds. They're kind of low growing and compact, and they really do almost have this continual blooming that offer lots of different colors. They come in creams and pinks and golds, and I've picked out a couple here that more of like a fuchsia and a kind of hard to tell, but maybe a purplish pinkish color. Some of them are very winter hardy. Again, it can vary. One of the series of this polyantha rose that features the names of the 7 dwarfs, they were introduced in the 1950s, and they're kind of funny. They're named Grumpy, Bashful, Doc, Sneezy, Sleepy, Dopey, and Happy. So kind of a fun little thing. You could do kind of a theme garden with some of those. Another, probably the most popular type of class of roses worldwide because of their really profuse blooming is the floribundas. They're these really large flowers that, again, are more of a clustered type arrangement. Their stems are shorter than hybrid teas, so they're not very suitable for arrangements. They're also bushier than hybrid teas, so they really look good if you plant them in groups of 3 or more. They're pretty wide. Hardiness is usually pretty widespread as far as zones. These can go from anywhere from a 2 to a 9, whereas hybrids only go from about a 5 to a 7, 8, 9, somewhere around in there. But floribundas, they're a cross basically between a hybrid and a polyantha. So that's why I put them here. After we kind of talked about the polyanthas and the hybrids, then we get a floribunda. And these have been around since the 1940s, so they've been around for a long time. A couple interesting ones to note. This iceberg here on the right, it is nearly thornless, and some say it has some shade tolerance. And it comes in a climbing form as well, and it has this really dark green foliage with really clean white blooms. It doesn't have a whole lot of fragrance, but it is a long bloomer, usually about 3 or 4 feet in height, and it's really good on like a mat for mass plantings. But it's just kind of a little bit of a different one there. The other one I picked out, Angel Face. It's got those deep lavender blooms with kind of wavy petals. You can kind of see that's a little bit different and unique. But this one is very fragrant. So just 2 of them there. A couple other interesting ones that I think, hot cocoa. It's like a russet color. I think that's a really unusual looking really plant of any kind, especially a rose. Mardi Gras is this top one, and Tenacious is also an interesting one. All of these floribundas, so that cross between those kind of more shrub bush type, the polyantha, and the long stem rose.
Amanda, we have one question. Someone asked, is the lovely fairy bred from the older variety of fairy roses?
That's a good question. I did not investigate its heritage. I apologize, but this one is trademarked. This is a patented rose. Yeah, I apologize. I'm not sure. There's so many different series that I'm not sure.
I'll look and see if I can find something on it.
Okay. And then we come to the grandifloras. So these are a cross of the hybrid teas in the floribundas. So they produce even something a little bit more different. These are very tall bush types. So we can kind of see that parentage of that hybrid tea where we have the long stems, but then the bush type from that floribunda polyantha cross. These are really vigorous. They have that clustering characteristics of the floribundas and that perfect hybrid tea form. You can see this. Queen Elizabeth is one of the first ones that were bred in 1954. Really kind of that perfect shape. I guess whatever you consider perfect, but really kind of nice shape for a rose. These flowers on the grandifloras are larger than the floribundas, but not quite as large as the hybrid teas. So they do have individual stems though, like their parentage, the hybrid teas, that are good for flower arrangements, and they are considered a continuous flower. So you get that kind of from their polyantha parentage back there. Couple other grandifloras of note, Lagerfield and Fame. Some really kind of striking ones, especially Flame. It's almost neon looking, I think. And then we have this pale lavender of the Lagerfield. But you can see that shape and that they would be good for arrangements, but they are kind of more of like bushy type. So something very different in what they might look like as far as what your goal is, right? We talked about goals. Roses can also be classified by the number of petals on their bloom. So you might see something advertised as a double, double petals or singly born petals or semi-doubles. And I've listed them here, kind of how those are usually classified. So this is another way to classify them. As I kind of set out to really dive into some of the classifications, it was like, some people use this kind of classification, others use the other type, how they grow. A lot of information to kind of wade through too. Roses are typically sold by grades. So the grades are assigned based on the height and the age. So typically roses are about 2 years old, like field grown roses, and they're graded according to their vigor and their size. So we've got 1s, 1.5s, and 2s. So number 1 is the largest, and see at 18 inches there, approximately from the base there to the tip. The most nurseries only handle 1s and 1.5s. Bargain roses that you might find in the bargain bin, those are often culls or they're below the grading standard. So just kind of keep in mind that you get what you pay for. In terms of that, definitely, you're buying something that is a little bit less vigorous to begin with and smaller. So that there's probably a reason it's on discount. So roses can be purchased in a couple different ways. First, they come in containers, like we've probably all seen. They can be planted anytime in the growing season. It's recommended that you at least buy number ones in a 2-gallon pot or number like 1.5 in a 1-gallon pot because they're a little smaller. Often those field grown roses that are potted up, they have too many roots removed to develop really vigorous after planting when you get too far down there. So but these can be a good option to be planted anytime with proper care and maintenance. They should do well. You can also buy them bare root roses. A lot of the ones that you buy through catalogs or whatnot will come bare roots. And often these are mailed to you, but when you're selecting them in a person, make sure they have plump, green, smooth bark. Make sure that the roots are well balanced and they appear fresh. It should feel kind of slightly heavy versus dried out and brittle. So there is, a little bit of that to kind of take stock of when you buy them and you're not buying them in person. Roses can be purchased. We talked about on the container side, they can be purchased bare roots, but then also a note here is that some of them are grafted versus their own root roses. So grafted ones will have a joint like you see in the picture here because they have been grafted onto the stalk of another rose that is most likely thought to be more vigorous, or maybe it's a little bit more disease resistant. So that might have some advantages to having a grafted rose. You can also buy own root bare roses, that doesn't have a grafting joint, and those will be just what you typically think of a plant with no grafting joint right here. But that's what that kind of knob is if you're looking at something like that. So sometimes when we see something like this, when a rose is planted and it seems to like change its color, that's if you have like a pink rose, it suddenly turns red, or if we have, like in this instance, a white, what we thought was a white rose, and it suddenly shoots this red one up, that's a failed graft union. Or it's been maybe buried too deeply, and those flowers that are kind of not true to what you thought it was going to be are attributed to the rootstock. So that can happen. They're kind of referred to as suckers over here. You see the circle that I have there, that'd be like a sucker coming up for the root, and it's likely not going to have the same characteristics as the ones that you bought. My parents had one of these that kind of seemingly reverted back to its original color or whatever. Very kind of interesting little thing to happen. Growing conditions. So what are roses like? They prefer morning sun, where the light conditions, they prefer morning sun, but not full on of the heat sun. The reason they like morning sun, and why we like them to have morning sun, is because the leaves can dry down quickly and reduce disease problems. Whereas afternoon midsummer sun can kind of fade the petals or maybe burn the petals. We also need well-drained soils. That's essential. If it's not available where you want it to have, you need to consider a raised bed or installing some sort of subsurface tile drainage before you plant it. They're not going to like the wet feet. They're going to want some drainage to be had there. If you're not sure about your drainage, there's a couple different ways you can test it. You can dig a foot in your soil, about a foot wide by a foot deep, with straight sides, fill it up with water and let it sit overnight. This kind of prepares the soil by saturating it completely so that you can get a really accurate reading. Then the next day you would go and you would refill it. You place a stick at the surface level and you measure the level of water every hour until it's empty. The ideal drainage situation we like to have is about 2 inches per hour. If it's less than an inch, you need to improve your drainage, or you need to pick a different plant. If it's more than 4 inches, per hour. That's too fast. You're going to need to improve your structure. You're going to need to add more organic matter for some of that water retention, compost, water retention, and build organic matter. It kind of helps that a heavy clay situation drain, and also helps compost can either help a heavy clay drain, or it can also hold water for sandy soils that might drain away too quickly. So compost can be an option to kind of augment your soil. And like I mentioned, building a raised bed gives you complete control over what's in it, so that might be an option as well. If you're planting just in the ground, you can add like something like bone meal or a super phosphate to the soil for a phosphorus source to get those roots kind of the extra boost. If you're planting a grafted plant, make sure that bud union, I think I have a picture here in a minute, bud union is going to be 1 or 2 inches below the surface. So that prevents the suckering from happening. If you're planting a bare root bush, it might be advantageous to soak it in water for about 24 hours prior to planting. That way it's nice and kind of waterlogged a little bit, fresh to go into the ground. You can do something like this right here of digging an extra large hole so the roots can spread. You might want to separate that topsoil from a subsoil. And then this is particular for bare root. You'd like to kind of build a cone-shaped mound so that you can kind of put the rose roots right on top of it, like you see in this picture. And then you would fill and mound it up around the base of the soil there. So it might be necessary to transplant your roses at some time. So you want to do so during a period of dormancy, usually sometime between December or March in Ohio. Prior to moving it, you want to cut it 1/3 of the canopy back. That kind of just helps conserve the nutrients a little bit, conserve its resources a little bit. And then when you are transplanting it, you want to remove as much of the root ball as possible so that you can minimize disturbance and any kind of root injury. So definitely start out wide. And this is kind of true of most plants that you might transfer. Watering, I always recommend doing the finger test, for really anything. Determine if your soil has enough moisture for the roses. So if your finger is moist, or that's a good situation. But if it's, the upper 1 or 2 inches is dry, it's time to water. And deep watering infrequently is the best thing you can do for these. You want to avoid any kind of overhead watering, since roses are prone to several different diseases that can be caused by the soil splashback. You want to avoid overhead watering. If you have to do it in the morning or the early or you'd want to do it in the morning or the early afternoon, so it has plenty of time to dry, like we talked about, so that kind of reduces the risk of disease. This is true for a lot of different types of plants, but roses also. Thorough deep watering. Don't ever give like light surface applications. You want to make sure it is deep, so that it penetrates the soil to a good depth. And you'd like to ideally kind of soak it to a depth of at least like a foot. Think about where those roots are, and that can be a lot of water applied in a slow amount of time.
Amanda, you're muted.
Sorry. So another option might be an irrigation method like this one right here. If you have multiple perennials in a bed, you might consider that. It can kind of drip slowly. That can be an option as well. There are a lot of different fertilizers that are available. Most of them have a varying analysis. So I'd say just pay attention to what you're buying. Regular garden fertilizers, typically, like the generic garden fertilizers, like a 10-10-10 or 20-20-20, they can be used as well. You don't have to buy rose food. I would avoid anything that has a high nitrogen content. So if it has a really high first number and then smaller the second numbers, you'd want to kind of stay away from that, because that's for turf. You want to fertilize in the spring after the danger of frost has passed, and after you do any pruning that you intend to do. Then you can fertilize it as many as 4 to 6 weeks, or every 4 to 6 weeks until early August. I would stop fertilizing in early August. I'm sorry, yes, early August. But however, here's a caveat. If you have the shrub type roses that only bloom once, it should only be fed once in mid-April, and don't fertilize those after July. This just helps them kind of get more winter hardiness, kind of ready for the winter. You can see here though, these rose foods, I said you didn't need to buy rose food. See how they're different. One's a 14, 24, 24, one's only a 4, 2, 4, one's an 8, 10, 8. So they're not all created equally. So that's why I say just pay attention to what you're buying, so that you know what you're putting on, and how much food or fertilizer your plants are actually getting. Remember, this is not the food that the plant needs. This just helps them photosynthesize and create the food that they actually need. Just an important point. Like anything, this comes with pests, right? So, and good pest control begins with you. There are a lot of cultural habits that we as gardeners can practice that go a long way to reducing disease and pest problems. First, like we just talked about, watering. Proper watering is essential. We already discussed that. Plants also that need proper spacing, like the spade there in the picture. You need adequate spacing between them to promote air circulation. It's just as important as proper pruning. You see this picture right here. We'll talk a little bit more about pruning here in a minute, but this is pruned to an outside bud. You see this little bud right here, and it's on the outside. That's important to kind of open up the center, which is really good for air circulation. As well as cleaning up in the fall. Raking up fallen leaves and debris from around the roses can help prevent spread of diseases, particularly if you had a disease the past year. You'd want to remove as much debris as you could. A lot of those are fungi that live on the leaves that fall down and can overwinter easily, and then they just contribute to the problem again next year. So cleanup can be an easy way to mitigate some or reduce our risk of some of these pests. Another, probably the worst enemy of every rose gardener is black spot. This is a fungus that causes these dark circular spots in the leaves that eventually turn the leaf yellow, and then they drop off and they get really ugly. It generally occurs in mid-May to early August. So basically all of the growing season that we have here in Ohio. When it's wet and we have poor air circulation, those conditions help spread this disease. Again, that wet leaf surface encourages the development and the spread. So back to that overhead watering is a no-no. Avoiding that will go a great way in spreading this if you have it. A disease that's often commonly mistaken for black spot is Cercospora. Fortunately, many of the fungicides that we have that are labeled for black spot are also labeled for Cercospora. So that's kind of fortunate that either one, or the products will work on either one if you misdiagnose it or something. But roses can also be susceptible to a rust, but if you have this, you can apply a fungicide and some cultural management, like we talked about, raking up infected leaves and getting rid of them greatly reduce that. Leaf buds and stems, even stems, can get this mildew, powdery mildew. This happens when we have spring conditions that are cool, and we have cool, damp nights, and then we have daytime temperatures that are really high, coupled with maybe some poor air circulation. I had a plant kind of next to the house on either side of my porch, and one of them would get powdery mildew every year and the other one was just fine. The one that got powdery mildew every year, it was just in this little microclimate where it didn't get dried out as quickly. It stayed in the shade just a little bit longer where it was positioned in the house, and consequently, you could tell a difference. I moved into this house, so I assume they were planted at the same time, same age, but the one that was just in that little microclimate received a little bit too much shade, a little, stayed wet a little too long, or a little longer than the other one. It was much smaller than the one that got the proper conditions. So you can even see that just right there in your own front yard. So this really thrives when we have high humidity. That's ideal for really any type of fungus. Especially if you have a rose that's located maybe near a pond or a stream or maybe another warm, damp situation like I was just describing. Ways to mitigate this is to clean up old leaves. You can prune and any pruned material, so don't leave your clippings there in the garden. Again, stopping any overhead watering. You can use a sulfur powder or wettable powder to mitigate this, which kind of interrupts the cellular process of the fungi and provides basically an environment that they don't want to live in. But it has to be applied in early spring while it's still dormant. So, and then it needs reapplied after it rains. So it has its downfalls, right? There are many fungicides available for those that don't want to take on fungicide or don't want to use fungicides. There's been some research done with baking soda and oil sprays, but I would advise to test it, to make sure it doesn't injure the plant beforehand. And some of those are commercially available, but just make sure they're labeled for powdery mildew would be my suggestion. Others, so kind of like more disease types, rose mosaic virus is the most common virus on roses. You see that there on the left. Basically, don't plant infected roses. If you have the discard of the infected plants, it spreads basically through the infected stalk. It's not transmitted on pruners or shovels, so that's actually really a good news, as some of these other fungi, they can spread on pruners and shovels and things because they spread through spores. But this one doesn't. So if you have something like this, it weakens the plant over many years and there's no cure. So you just have to get rid of it. Other things that we can see on roses, this top picture right here is a stem canker. This could come from like a wound that it was inflicted upon it. Improperly pruned canes can sometimes lead to infections. The best thing to do is prune these out, choose the lowest point of infection and prune it there. Make sure that you disinfect your pruning tools with a bleach solution, because sometimes these can kind of be attached to a problem with a fungus. So we want to make sure that we provide proper sanitization. Botrytis blight, like you see in the bottom, is another problem that we often see on roses. It kind of looks like kind of water-soaked lesions on petals, and as it the infection progresses, it moves down the cane and kind of girdles the cane, and then you end up with these kind of stubs that are left. To kind of mitigate this, you need good air circulation, get rid of the flowers, fading flowers, and apply a fungicide to it to protect the healthy tissue that might be left. Another one that's kind of on kind of the watch list is rose rosette disease. This is spread through a mite, and it causes this rapid elongation of new shoots, and you get this kind of witch's broom cluster of small branches. An infected bush like this, infected plant like this, often dies within 1 or 2 years, and the mite is so tiny. See this picture right here on the bottom right, so tiny. It can feed inside the flower and the leaf buds, and so that's where pesticides can't reach. So that's not a viable option to control this. It transmits the disease by feeding on the infected rose, and then feeds on healthy plants. So it can spread them easily like that. The top right shows a picture in comparison of what an infected rose would look like with rose rosette disease. That you see that red new shoots growing, and just kind of like it can be excessively thorny as well. Best to just remove infected canes, destroy them away from the garden, keep a vigilant watch, make sure it doesn't come back. If it's badly infected, dig up the whole plant, roots and all, and destroy it. Also, if you live near a woods, or perhaps like an old pasture that is not really maintained, it might have multiflora rose in it. This multiflora rose can also be a host for rose rosette disease, or not a host, but like kind of a host, yeah. That can cause the spread. So it can spread to our roses in our yard. So if you have multiflora rose somewhere near you, you might want to consider getting rid of that as well. The bleach solution that you might consider is a 10%, or sometimes we'll do a 1 part bleach, well, yeah, 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. So fairly light solution there, Pam. Other insects that you might encounter, aphids. Those are a problem. You see those little tiny green things along the stem of that picture there. Those are little aphids. They're a problem when it's cool and wet. And then again, when it turns hot and dry, they disappear. So that's kind of good. But they're sap feeders. They feed on growing tissue of the shoots, of the stems, of the buds. There are natural predators that eat aphids. So, that's the trade-off. If you choose to use an insecticide, you're going to also kill the natural predators that are eating the aphids. Usually aphids in general don't really harm the plant, but if they have large numbers, it can lead to distorted buds, or the flowers might not get as big. Over fertilizing your roses can promote conditions that are really favorable for aphids. So I would be careful of that. Now, but remember what I said about don't overhead water. Well, one control for aphids is to spray them with water. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. Control for aphids, you can spray it with a forceful sprays of water. Again, I would do this in the morning so it has plenty of time to dry. Like we talked about, we don't want to increase our risk of disease just to get rid of the aphids. But there you have it, clear as mud, I suppose. Japanese beetles, also a huge problem. I'm sure probably if any of you have roses out there, you've been lamenting the day that you saw your first Japanese beetle. They skeletonize the petals. They eat an entire floral petals in early July. And if you have a small amount, you can kind of pick them off because Japanese beetles are kind of interesting. They are attracted to each other by their scent. So where you have one, more will come. That is one thing about traps. I often see Japanese beetle traps, and they're really good at what they do. They trap them, but they'll bring in your neighbors' Japanese beetles and your other neighbors and the farm down the way. They will attract them, as they can kind of smell it each other. So where you have a whole bunch of them, the smell is going to be harder or greater. So traps are maybe not the best idea, especially in a small setting like this, because it just attracts more beetles. You can protect your roses during certain times of the year when the Japanese beetles are most active. You can protect it like with a cheesecloth or with a fine netting during those peak flight times. Some insecticides work for control, but since new beetles are arriving, daily, hourly, it's kind of a constant thing. So they can definitely be a problem. Other pesky insects that we might see, a cane borer. They tunnel into the canes soon after winter pruning. So if a hole is present, you might cut it back until you see a healthy cane. You can use wood glue to seal the wound if you desire. You also might see these interesting little, circles that are cut out of your rose bushes. Leafcutter bees actually make these, and they are cavity nesting bees. And so they take little pieces of the leaf and they line their little cavity with it, and they place their egg in their little pollen patty, and then they seal it up with a little bit of mud, and that's how they create more little bees. So if you have a pollinator garden and you're really into pollinators and you see this, that is what caused that, a leafcutter bee. So you don't want to be spraying your roses if you have leafcutter bee activity on there, because you're attracting what you intended to attract. You might also come across midges, rose midges. They attack the bloom. So if you have a really healthy looking bush with lots of growth, but you don't have any blooms, you might look for midges. These can be controlled through a granular insecticide that goes into the water, and goes into the soil, and then you can water it in. That's one of the tactics that you can use to mitigate rose midge. Sawfly larvae might look something like this. Insecticides work for these as well. Overall, though, when we talk about the percentage of that leaf that has been affected, it's not going to be a high percentage, and there's probably going to be plenty of growth on the rest of the plant to photosynthesize properly. What you don't like is just the way it looks, right? But it's not going to harm the tree, or sorry, the plant. So kind of thinking about, what's the benefit, the pros and cons there. Probably can live with a little bit of sulfite, larva damage. If you have a huge infestation, that's another story. And that's what those look like. They blend in very well. So, and they're often underneath the leaf, so they're kind of hard to find. Or you have to be looking in the right spot, essentially. Spider mites, they can cause this mottling appearance. It might often be mistaken for rose mosaic virus, but if you really kind of look at them, you'll begin to notice the differences. These feed on the bottom of leaves. If you suspect you have it, you can take a piece of white paper, put it underneath the leaves, kind of tap the leaves, and then if there are little black spots moving on your paper, you probably have spider mites. When we have really dry conditions, that's when we see them more, especially if you have miniature roses that are planted along sidewalks. Those are especially prone to spider mites. You might even see webs on the stems. That's a telltale sign that you have spider mites. Again, you can use a really strong water hose to knock them off, and that can work wonders. But again, do that in an early morning or early afternoon so it has plenty of time to dry. As well, there are broad spectrum pesticides that can work too if you're want to go that route, but remember that beneficial insects will also be killed as well. Thrips are another one that might, I'm sorry, there's the webbing. Thrips are another one that might plague roses. They hide in the blooms, so you can't really treat these with insecticides. These are carried on the wind, so often if you have a windbreak near your roses, that can really help. Their feeding damage causes really these little scars or these brown streaks in the petals. So if you remove the spent blooms, that can really help reduce the problems with thrips. And I've mentioned some beneficial insects if you're not familiar with some of those. There are green lacewings. These are lady beetles. We have a number of beneficials that can eat some of those, especially like the aphids, like lady beetles like aphids. So they can kind of help control some of that population if you have an issue. So how do we take care of these roses? Now we know what to plant. We know a little bit about what diseases we might be on the lookout for. We know some cultural strategies that we're going to take to mitigate some of those, either some of those pests or some of those diseases that might plague roses. How do we take care of these beyond that? What I wanted to kind of make a differentiation between deadheading and pruning. So one is a trim and one is a major cut. So that deadheading is just that removal of the faded blooms before they go to seed. So just kind of a summer kind of day-to-day pruning, but we call it deadheading. You shouldn't cut them out after October 1st. You want to allow the plant to begin kind of hardening off for winter. Deadheading can be a good way to lessen the likelihood of diseases such as botrytis from becoming a problem. So there are definitely reasons why we might do some deadheading. But in terms of that, you don't have to deadhead. A lot of modern roses are bred to rebloom, so technically you don't have to deadhead. But if you choose, you can pop off the old blooms. You can snip them with the tips of the pruners. Best case scenario is to cut it at a 45-degree angle, about a quarter of an inch above a 5 leaflet. And that's the thing to keep in mind. You're not going to hurt the root roses if you do this properly. So you can see this picture right here. The prune is at a 45-degree angle. It's about a quarter of an inch above that 5 leaflet right there. So this would be a proper prune. So there's ways to approach it. It's good if you don't do anything. Like I said, modern roses are meant to rebloom. You can pop them off. You can snip off the tops with the pruners. That might be a little bit better, but then you're going to get that kind of black tip because it's going to die back to the next leaflet. If you don't want that brown ugly thing or the stick looking thing, you want kind of a cleaner cut, it's best to do it at a 45-degree angle. And don't be afraid, you're not going to hurt your roses by doing this. So if I'm making differentiation between deadheading, well, what about pruning, Amanda? That's something totally different. Pruning is a big cut, right? So spring pruning, always prune them in the spring. to produce an open-centered plant. That's kind of your goal with pruning roses. You want that light penetration, that air penetration or air circulation, to cut down on the disease incidence. And the best time to do this pruning is after the forsythia has started to bloom. We don't want to prune roses in the fall. And you don't even have to worry about pruning them perfectly. You can use some people have used like hedge clippers, but then you are going to end up with a little bit of brownness. But so don't prune them in the fall, but you should wait until after forsythia has started to bloom to prune them in the spring. Again, best to do it at that 45-degree angle. If you're doing a real kind of hard prune, only recommend like I think this is supposed to be a half to a third. I think I got one wrong there. You want to remove dead wood particularly, or take out any weak or crossing branches, cut off any root suckers that you might have, and again, kind of prune that to an outside eye. If roses are grafted, there might be that sucker growth, so remove it. And the best way to do that is to dig down to the root where the sucker is and actually kind of tear it off. If you cut it off, it's only going to encourage more regrowth of several suckers. So kind of recommend doing that if you have a grafting type of problem with the sucker. Roses like hybrid teas, grandifloras, floribundas, and miniatures, those produce their best flowers on new or current season's wood. So that's the reason for taking out some of the older stems. I said I'd talk about outside eyes. When you prune it, you want to prune it to an outside eye, and that's going to encourage that kind of urn shape to open up the bush, because the outside eye is eventually going to become the next stem. So this picture here on the bottom left is kind of shows bad pruning job, basically. This one right here has been pruned to up too high. Remember we said 1/4 of an inch. So what's going to happen is the rest of this is going to die back to about right here. So they just kind of like wasted that a little bit. This one has been pruned too deeply at really greater than a 45-degree angle, I'd say, but definitely deeper, definitely down past where this outside eye is. And then this one would be a more proper one right here. Again, a really good cut over here. That's what we want to see right there. So when should you do this then? So for hybrid teas, grandifloras, floribundas, minis, prune those hard in early spring. You can remove a half, sorry, I was wrong, a half to a 2/3 of the plant height, not the plant. Remove all the dead canes, like I said, the small ones, the weak ones. You can leave about 3 to 5 healthy, stout canes that are kind of evenly spaced. Choose those that you want to cut back to those outward facing buds. For repeat flowers, like those shrub type roses, you want to leave it for a couple years before you do anything. Want to really make it to get established. These repeat flower shrub roses, they bear flowers on mature stems that are not so old that they're old and woody, but that they're mature. So if you severely prune these, that are going to result in a reduced flower production. So what you're going to want to do is you kind of use the 1/3 method. In the spring, you're going to remove 1/3 of the old canes. You're going to keep 1/3, and then you're going to remove the remaining canes. If you have some old garden type roses, the once bloomers, you want to do that after flowering, and the repeat bloomers or flowers, you want to do the before flowering. So the once blooming roses, they produce flowers on old wood. So pruning should be delayed until after flowering. Otherwise, you're going to get reduced flowers. Then for the once bloomers, you're only going to want to do as little or as much pruning as is required to maintain the plant. So if you thin it down, remove the old wood. These are the roses that don't really need annual pruning, especially if there's no dead or damaged wood. You can just kind of leave them. Now the repeat ones, they bloom on new and old wood, and these can be pruned before flowering, and they can be pruned a little bit harder without fear of losing too many blooms. They do pretty well, pretty resilient. So what about pruning climbers? You want to do that in early spring, but ramblers you want to do after flowering. They might need a few seasons. Each of these might need a few seasons in the garden before you begin to prune them. In many cases, the way you approach these for pruning wise is to just limit the removal of any damaged wood, any winter damaged wood. That's how you kind of approach pruning these two types of roses. And the difference is the timing, like I said. So because ramblers are once blooming, they're pruned right after flowering in the early summer. And because climbers are repeat bloomers, they need to be pruned in early spring. You can kind of reduce the side shoots on these or the laterals to about 3 to 6 inches, and that stimulates more flower production and results in more blooms. And then, like I mentioned earlier, if you train them horizontally, it encourages some additional growth and additional side shoots that would have more blooms. We talked about that earlier. That's kind of pruning in a nutshell. There's a couple different differences in timing and, you know, the method you would take, how aggressive you would be, depending on the type of roses that you're, or the rose that you're growing.
Hey, Amanda, before you move on, we got a couple questions. One is about the cane borer. They would like to know the best way to prevent this after cutting their roses back.
You know, most of you know, what the universities or the extension services recommend is that you can use sort of a wood glue to seal that up. But it's kind of a hard one. You can't really use necessarily a pesticide to get at it or something like that, since it's inside. Yeah, beyond pruning it below the hole and
could you use like a paraffin wax to prune it up maybe too?
Perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah, what I had recommended was some sort of, a wood glue.
Sounds good. The next one is, when do you prune David Austin roses? Are you familiar with the David Austin rose?
Yeah, I have some David Austins at the end.
Okay.
Trying to remember what class they fall into. Got some more. Do they know? It depends on what type they are. I can't recall right now what they are. If they're floribundas or.
I Googled it. It's English climber.
Oh, a climber version? Yeah, a climber version. So
that's what I Googled. I don't know if theirs is. If you could, Pamela, if you could type in the chat box what kind of David Austin it is. Is it a climber? Is it a shrub rose?
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to.
And that's all the questions right now, Amanda.
Okay. Okay, so then we kind of move into how do you protect them during the winter? And there are a couple different options, from doing nothing to doing some of these techniques. So I'll just give you kind of some examples. There's definitely maybe some survival concerns for some. If you're going to choose this option, mounding the soil up. After the first hard freeze, usually around Thanksgiving, you put a foot of mulch over each rose bush. If it's been dry fall, you need to water it before you mulch. I recommend you prune back the canes. Hold on just a second. Somehow I just activated my cell phone and it told me it didn't understand me. I recommend you prune back the canes and tie it together with some twine. Maybe 10 or 12 inches of deep soil might be additional, and don't rake it up from the base. Remember, we talked about some of those disease problems can be an issue. So putting about a foot of mulch or some additional soil will help for that winter protection. If you have an extremely cold area or an open area where winter damage is common, the best way to protect, if you have a climbing rose, is to shield the entire plant with earth. After the first frost, you detach the plant from its support, you tie its canes together, you bend them to the ground, arching them near the plant's base so that you don't want to break them. You can pin the canes down with some cross stakes and kind of heel in the canes. And then you can mound soil over the entire plant. Make sure you mark the spot so you know where it's at. But that could be one way to, if you're really concerned about winter hardiness for climbers. Another option can be a wire mesh collar around them filled with basically some sort of coarse mulching material, peat moss, pine bark, shredded leaves, straw, something like that. Some people tie burlap on top of this. Also, you can mound the soil up underneath it, or around the base of the collar, about 10 or 12 inches. That can also work as well. So you see wire mesh, you see a variety of wood slats kind of made a little bit of a collar around it. Another option can be just burlap. You don't have to prune these beforehand, other than maybe removing some canes that might be rubbing together. Tie the canes together with twine, bind with some burlap, and you can also kind of mound it mound some soil around the base as well. Some people like to spray these with a dormant oil and like maybe a lime sulfur that might give the plants a little bit of a head start the following spring. Now, all these things are for specific type of roses, right? If you have some of these roses that are a little bit, that are definitely made for our area, made for our zone. Knockouts certainly don't need winter protection. They're bred to be okay, but if you're really into roses, as you begin to kind of get some of these maybe a little bit stranger ones, they might warrant some winter protection. So that's where you need to be cognizant of that. Carrie, how long?
Amanda, before you move on,
yeah,
it was David Austin shrub rose that she was inquiring about pruning, or when to prune.
Yeah. I was going to go refer back to, so if it's a repeat flower, that's when you're going to do, I didn't put down when you do these, in the spring. You're going to redo these. So if it's a repeat flower, you're going to want to do it in the spring. Kind of a general rule. If it only flowers one time, then that's when you do it afterwards, after it flowers. So do this in the spring before it flowers. Carrie, was this supposed to be over at 7:30 or 8? I think I forgot to ask.
I didn't put an end time down. So I just advertised it started at 6:30 and I didn't put an end time down.
Okay. Well, we can kind of go through this next part. So when I had a fortunate opportunity, one of my master gardeners for a number of years was actually involved in the horticulture industry, and her husband was a rose breeder for Jackson Perkins. So Miami County got quite a bit of schooling on roses and how they come to be in our nurseries. And so I thought I'd share just a little bit about rose breeding programs and how they come to be, just kind of quickly, kind of a bird's eye view a little bit. These rose breeding programs are over 100 years old, and there are only 4 full-time breeders in the country. I'm sorry, with Jackson Perkins. This is Jackson Perkins information since she was privy to it. But just I kind of wanted to get the scope of it. They do 100,000 crosses a year. They produce 400,000 hybrid seeds a year. And they have over 40 years of breeding information that they keep. So I'm sure this is the same for all the rose, breeding programs in around the world, probably. But just kind of, it was interesting to me, just the scope of what you don't really think about that goes on to get those roses in the nurseries to you. This really is like a long process. They have objectives that they wanted to meet. They select parents. They do go through a hybridization process. They select that progeny. They do global trials, and then it hits the market years later. Look at this, 4 to 6 years of the progeny selection. So we're talking about, ballpark 6, 7, 8, 9, like 9 years between when they're like first somebody drummed it up till it comes to, Dayton Nursery or wherever you buy your roses. But they look at, what's going to happen in the next 10 years. They analyze all kinds of data on what consumers might want, what their ongoing goals are of the company, of the breeding program. Then they're going to choose parents that are likely going to provide that progeny for them. And Jackson Perkins, they have 300 varieties in their gene pool, so it's quite large. They conduct pollinations in that early spring or early summer, harvest and clean the seeds. They end up planting them around December, and they end up with about 400 seedlings. This is, remember, just for like one variety here. They, they take care of them. They evaluate them for 6 years before they're going to be introduced, and then at that point they go to international trialing. And these are some of the countries where they do their trialing. So just kind of amazed at, how these things come to be. If you don't know anybody in that kind of world, you don't really think about it, I suppose. But she also kind of made note of like the blue rose. People have this kind of fascination with maybe a blue rose. It's actually, the color of the flower is predominantly attributed to 2 types of pigments, and they are specific to produce pinks and reds. One of them produces a pink and red color. The other one produces a yellow-orange color. So roses can be bred in colors ranging from white to yellow to orange to pink to red, based upon the genes that are available in that gene pool of that plant. So blue pigments are not natural occurring in the genetic makeup of roses. So they lack the gene that will produce the blue pigment that are present in other flowers. But there are some other ways you can make blue roses. And one of them is to kind of take a light colored rose or a white rose and obviously, put it in water, right? But that's not really a true one, right? That's just kind of what happens. Another way is they're looking at is to actually insert a gene from another plant that actually makes that blue pigment and put it into the rose plant and get the rose to express that gene, that blue colored flower. So I think it's kind of interesting. They're working on it because and really only time will tell if they can actually invent a truly blue rose, because what we have now is more of like what would probably be considered an attractive lavender color, not a true blue. So basically it's scientifically impossible to have a blue rose in a more natural way. So they're actually, roses are actually red and violets are actually blue, because they do have that pigmentation ability in their gene pool. So what we end up with, like I said, is the more lavender types. So what about roses for the Midwest? I just described the whole process of how you get a patented rose. That might be attractive to you to buy a patented rose. They have a long history. They've been trialed. There's been a lot of, a lot of dollars, a lot of time spent researching and trialing those. So it might be beneficial to buy a patented rose. Represents a lot of years of breeding experience. Typically they might be, have a better bloom form, especially if you're one that wants to start to get into some competition, or if you grow for the fair or something like that. They don't bloom as long though, but they're better disease resistant, and they might have a kind of a greater vigor and growth. And they typically come out with like newer colors and fragrances that can be kind of attractive. So what kind of roses might you, for the Midwest, these are some good collections for disease resistance. You'll notice knockout roses there that everybody has. There's also an easy to love collection. There's a number of them that are just kind of, you can see the wide variety of them there. And I've provided Carrie with these handouts so that you can kind of look at these and decide, oh yeah, I'd like to look for one of these. I like some of these unusual ones. I think the Cinco de Mayo one is really unusual, not something I'd typically think of for a rose. And I wanted to include, I just picked one of the suppliers, the Weeks roses, and just kind of to look at, what's coming out this year, what's coming out in 2021. If you're buying a patent rose, you definitely need to do it early. They're probably already probably sold out by this point, because you can order them really early. But what's new from Weeks? Golden Opportunity is a climber that it was introduced by Weeks Rose. It's really tall and it has good disease resistance, and it has these really formal double blooms. It has a kind of a fruity tea-ish fragrance. It can also kind of be, like I said, some of those climbers can be, or I'm sorry, so that's the climber. The ground cover is the other one, the Playful Happy Trails. Those are more like that single petaled. So remember we talked about classifications of petals. They have a single petaled, that large yellow eye makes them really unique. This is kind of a trailing, spreading bush type of ground cover, very disease resistant. So I tried to pick some that, you know, would be more disease resistant and therefore a little easier to take care of. If you're looking for an unusual bloom with unusual coloring, you might consider the Ringo All-Star. It's got that kind of like, not the greatest in this picture, but it's almost like a melony type orange type salmon pink with that distinct cherry red eye showing its yellow stamens. This is really compact. It's disease resistant. So that can be an interesting choice there. Pink Snowflakes is another single petal pink blooms that are on a low bushy type spreading type bush. Again, it has good disease resistance. Then I picked some Floribunda. This one is, remember, it's not blue, it's violet, but it has kind of a fruity, spicy fragrance, and it's about medium height, very good disease resistance. The other, the grandiflora that I have there, the grandiflora being the fun in the sun, and the silver lining floribunda, both good disease resistance and kind of those like medium type of height and stem length. Remember, the floribundas are kind of more bushy a little bit, but have that kind of hybrid parentage there, and as well as like kind of the grandifloras closely related. Perfume Factory, probably get some idea about what might be its claim to fame. This one's a classic kind of spiraled hybrid tea, kind of lavender pink in color, but it's got a really strong scent, kind of a fruity spice fragrance. It's medium tall, and the foliage on this one is really glossy green. So it's very striking color. This is Austin, David Austin English Rose that I had kind of picked out. This one has a very beautiful, exceptionally long flowering season, kind of almost peachy pink buds, and then they kind of turn white. Very attractive in the early spring, extremely disease resistant, has a very strong scent, and this one is its own root plant. So remember that distinction between the grafted ones and the own root plant. Do you have questions? So what's the future for roses? Maybe we'll have, or, you know, we kind of already have some headway, making some headway in the thornless roses. Maybe we'll have really compact plants with hybrid tea blooms. You can see that these are photoshopped, right? So, you know, maybe we'll have that. Maybe we'll have these brand new colors. If they do that kind of gene insertion and get some of these different colors, maybe we will have a blue one. Maybe we'll have really big tree roses, or maybe we'll have shade loving roses, or maybe we'll have drought tolerant roses, or ones that are really cold hardy. Maybe we'll have some that are different fragrances that, you know, they're working on stuff like this all the time. And then we come back to, you know, maybe we will eventually have that Rosa Arcus because of all the breeding that happens and all this headway that they're making. You know, maybe we will have something as truly as unique as that eventually. But Carrie, that is toward the end of my presentation. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any in the question and answer. Does anybody have any questions for Amanda before we end tonight? Amanda, did you post your link in, I didn't see it in the chat box for your triple ET?
Oh, no, here it is right there. Yeah, I'd appreciate if you.
Amanda just posted her triple ET in the chat box. So if you would go ahead and click on that, and that just evaluates her presentation and evaluates her teaching skills. And that helps us let our bosses know that we're doing our jobs. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Carrie Jagger, the Ag Educator in Morrow County, and I've posted a couple other links in the chat box. One, this is being recorded tonight, and I'll share it on our YouTube channel. And then the second is Amanda mentioned a handout earlier of the slides, and I'll post that on our website, which I put in the chat box. And then I have a blog that I write weekly, and I just share events that are happening around Morrow County and around the state, and then educational news articles as well. Karen asked if we could get the handouts. You can either email me, jagger.6@osu.edu, and I can email that to you, or like I said, it'll be posted on our website, morrow.osu.edu. Any more questions for Amanda? Amanda, that was great. I learned some stuff tonight too. I've never been a Rose fan, so I got some good stuff out of it.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me, and enjoy your evening, and happy rose gardening.